We back. Yeah, we back. Now, part two. Let's get back into it. Welcome back to a brand new series entitled The Biography of King Henri Christophe. Now, in this series, man, we're reading a legendary book, man. Legendary. I'm not even 100 pages into the book, but it's already legendary. Black Crown by Paul Clammer. Shout out to Paul Clammer, man. If you haven't watched part one, stop what you're doing, go back, start from the beginning. In this series, man, we are reading the life story of King Henri Christophe, man, and you get in my live reactions as I'm reading it. In part one, we set the scene. We talked about his origins, his childhood, his early years. And I would say by the time I left off, I would say Christophe was probably in his late 20s, early 30s. So we pretty much discussed his origins, his beginnings, where he come from, what was his teenage years like, how did he become free, how did he gain his freedom, how did he end up in America, how did he end up in the colony of Saint-Domingue, where did he come from, St. Kitts or Grenada. A lot of questions were thrown up in the air in part one, man. So start from the beginning, like I said. Now in part two, let's get back into it, man. This brutality was technically illegal under the Code Noir, but planters who were outnumbered nearly 10-1 in Saint-Domingue by the enslaved saw it as the only way to maintain order. Colonists lived in perpetual fear of a slave uprising. When Christophe first arrived in Cap Français, stories were told of François Macandal, a slave burned at the stake in the city's main square for trying to incite a revolt. Macandal had gone marooned from his plantation halfway between the city and the town of Limbe, and in January 1758 was arrested and accused of waging a campaign of poisonings that had spread terror across the north. When one of Macandal's alleged co-conspirators was interrogated, he spoke to the colonists' deepest fears by claiming that if he identified all the slave poisoners and malefactors, he would never finish since they were found on all the plantations. The ultimate aim was to weaken the white population so that the enslaved could reclaim their freedom. The poisoning paranoia mixed with the fear of heathen African religions, and Macandal was convicted of making magic amulets and sentenced to death. During his execution, he managed to briefly escape from his bonds, and although he was recaptured and forced back into the flames, he quickly became a legendary figure among both the enslaved and the colonists for his claim that the whites could never kill him, and that he would transform himself into a fly before the moment of death instead. Listening to the customers at the hotel, Christophe would have been one of the first to hear of the other events that might shake up the colony. In 1789, Louis XVI summoned the French Legislative Assembly, called the Estates General, for its first sitting in 175 years. Only delegates from the metropole were invited, but a party from Saint-Domingue traveled to Versailles to demand representation. A pointed discussion unfolded as to how many delegates might be allowed to be seated. When colonists asked that their numbers reflect the population of Saint-Domingue, one assembly member commented, "The free blacks are proprietors and taxpayers, and yet they have not been allowed to vote. And as for the slaves, either they are men or they are not. If the colonists consider them men, let them free and make them eligible for seats. If the contrary is the case, have we, in appropriating deputies according to the population of France, taken into consideration the number of our horses and mules?" There will be several attempts to answer these questions in both France and Saint-Domingue over the coming years, until the colony's enslaved population forcefully volunteered its own solution. For now, any debate over colonial representation was dominated by the Club Mosaic, the powerful planters' lobby that was ever quick to remind delegates of the centrality of the colonial trades to the French economy. Raged against them was the Abolitionist Society, founded in 1788. On October 22nd, 1789, the Marquis de Lafayette hosted a dinner for the society at Paris, attended by the celebrated British abolitionist and campaigner Thomas Clarkson and two of the wealthiest members of Saint-Domingue's free-colored community, Julien Raymond and Vincent Auger. Raymond and Auger appeared white, but due to the fact that each of them had a grandparent of African ancestry, they were denied any political rights in Saint-Domingue. Both men were rich from owning coffee plantations and owned large numbers of slaves. In keeping with the abolitionist campaigns in Britain at the time, the society was gradualist, seeking only a ban on the slave trade, followed by an amelioration of colonial slavery, leading eventually to the abolition. Now, time out. They always talking about, oh, the British was the first to abolish slavery. I mean, not first of all, stop it. It was the black man. You know, the black man took up arms and abolished slavery. But they always say, oh, the British abolished slavery. But you heard what they said. They said, listen, we just want to, place a slight ban on the slave trade, slightly improve, colonial conditions. And then maybe later down the line, we can, eventually lead to an abolition. You could obviously see they were not enthusiastic about it. They still wanted to keep getting that slave money. But now in the modern day, oh man, we were the first to abolish slavery. Stop it. Let's continue. Raymond and Auger argued that giving political representation to Saint-Domingue's free colored community was the only way to guarantee the colony's future stability, and that they were the only ones capable of restraining the colony's slaves. an argument they had earlier tried presented to the Club Mosaic. In hoping to outlaw the racial prejudice against themselves, they sought to align their interests fully with the white planter class. Let's continue. Vincent O.J. believed that promises of a gradual abolition of slavery were the best way to forestall fears of a slave revolt. Despite their similar wealth and status, the two men chose different approaches to claiming their rights. While Raymond decided to remain in Paris to lobby the National Assembly alongside influential figures like Abbé Grégoire, Vincent O.J. saw that the main struggle was to be found in Saint-Domingue. When he returned in October 1790, he discovered that revolutionary atmosphere had already been carried there from France. Colonial assemblies had been set up in the major cities as white colonists grabbed eagerly at the promise of more political autonomy and freer trade, but they had no desire to share power. The granting of political rights to the free colored population was explicitly rejected. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen that O.J. had seen so celebrated in Paris was a document to be treated with fear and suspicion in Cap Français, as its calls for the recognition of universal rights was deemed inadmissible in the toxic racial system that underpinned the colony. It was no accident that members of the Club Mosaic had even tried to prevent him returning to the colony, and he had to return via the United States, a journey part funded by Thomas Clarkson. Dismayed at what he had found on his arrival, Vincent O.J. gathered his supporters and decided that if his rights would not be granted willingly, and they would be taken by force. Vincent O.J. joined with Jean-Baptiste Chavannes, a veteran of the Chasseurs Volontaires, who had seen his own petition to join the assembly rejected on the grounds of race. Together, they gathered around 300 men and captured Chavannes' hometown of Gonrivière, a short distance from the town of Dondon. After repelling one attempt by the local militias to recapture the town, they fled across the border into Spanish Santo Domingo in the hope of launching a guerrilla campaign. The two men were captured in February 1791 and extradited back to Cap Français to be sentenced to death. Their very public executions were held on the Place d'Armes on the 25th of February and were almost certainly witnessed by Christophe, who would have recognized the ruined figure of Chavannes as he and Vincent O.J. were led into the square with ropes around their necks. After being made to repent for their crimes, they were slowly broken on the wheel. I was so shocked that I turned my head so as not to see, but I heard their horrible cries, recalled one French member of the National Guard. After their torture, the two men were beheaded. 2 days later, a further 22 people were condemned to death for their part in an uprising and their heads placed on spikes along major roads as a warning to others. Christophe had understood that membership of the Free Colored Militia was a way of raising one's status in the colony, so to see another member of the Savannah campaign killed so cruelly was a salutary lesson about the lengths to which the colonists would go when their power and status came under threat. Now, Jean-Baptiste Chavannes, you remember how they said back in the day when Christophe was a teenager, he was down in the United States at the American Revolutionary War with the French military, right? And Jean-Baptiste Chavannes was actually down there too. He went down to Georgia, for the military campaigns in the United States during the American Revolution. Jean-Baptiste Chavannes, one of them that got, tortured and beheaded in the public square. And that was one of his big homies. That was one of his, Christophe, Jean-Baptiste Chavannes, he knew him. Like, that was his homie, right? So he seen his homie get, destroyed and, just lynched in the public square, right? So, yeah, that's crazy. Let's continue. In the eyes of the whites, however, their reaction to Vincent O.J. and Chavannes' attempted uprising was entirely justified. They had only to be thankful that the men did not attempt to raise the enslaved population in their support. By early 1791, white fears at the new ideas of liberty arriving from France would spread beyond the free colored population to the people laboring on the plantations who cooked their food and waited on their tables. When their worst fears regarding a slave revolt were made reality 6 months later, many whites laid the blame directly at the door of the revolutionaries in France, never once bringing themselves to understand that those they had torn from Africa in the belief that they were subhuman could nurture dreams of freedom of their own. On the morning of the 23rd of August, 1791, the inhabitants of Cap Français woke to find a fine cloud of ash floating towards the city. The northern plains were on fire. One by one, and then by the dozen, the rich sugar plantations that stretched from city to the mountains were set ablaze, as those who labored there rose en masse to destroy the crops and machinery that were the source of the colonists' wealth and their own suffering. Within a week, more than 180 sugar plantations in 7 parishes had been completely destroyed. Within a month, all of the North's 27 parishes were in ruins, and more than 200 sugar plantations and 1,200 coffee plantations had been destroyed. Among those who had risen up against the system were the 808 enslaved people on the Galifet plantation, which was now turned into an army camp. By the end of November, perhaps many as 80,000 former slaves were in revolt. more than half of the total enslaved population of northern Saint-Domingue. Cap Français had been attacked 3 times by this new rebel army, which had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, and its citizens, including Christophe, were now under siege. The plan for the mass uprising had been set up at a secret meeting on the night of the 14th of August, while the streets of Cap Français thronged with thousands of slaves bringing produce to the Sunday market. A group of conspirators began to gather in the woods at Bois Caïman. Just off the road between Cap Français and the hill town of Limbe, it was perhaps no accident that this was the plantation from which Macandal had fled before plotting his poisoning campaign. The attendees were all high-status slaves from around 100 plantations, coachmen and plantation drivers who were natural leaders, afforded positions of trust by their masters. The leader of the plot was Dutty Boukman, a coachman and a priest, along with Jean-François Papillon and Georges Biassou. A fourth leader was almost certainly the free coachman from the Breda plantation who kept his own bench in the Cap Français church and whose status allowed him to move freely about the north, hiding in plain sight. He would soon adopt the name by which he would become one of the most famed figures of the age of revolutions, Toussaint Louverture. The mass uprising was set to begin just over a week later when the Colonial Assembly was due to meet in Cap Français, providing an opportunity to target Saint-Domingue's political leadership in a single attack. On the night of August 22nd, the leadership gathered at Bois Caïman for a second time to finalize the details of the plot and to hold a religious ceremony to dedicate themselves to its success. With Dutty Boukman presiding alongside a priestess named Sisid Fatima, a black pig was sacrificed in a ceremony that took elements of West African and Congolese traditions and blended them together to create something new and unique. Colonial commentators like Moreau de Saint Mary had written that with deep suspicion of voodoo dances, many slaves like to attend, not realizing that by forcing together those disparate parts of Africa, they might forge new syncretic religious identities of their own. In this way, Saint-Domingue's slave system gave birth to Haitian voodoo, and the ceremony at Bois Caïman would provide its founding myth. White refugees flooded into Cap Français. The insurgents had killed dozens in revenge attacks as the enslaved paid back their masters for the years they had suffered at their hands. Their savage barbarity has spared neither age nor sex, wrote the American slave trader Nathaniel Cunning, without irony to the U.S. Secretary of State and fellow slave owner Thomas Jefferson, telling him that the violence would make Nero blush. In fact, while many colonists died in reprisal killings, there were almost as many instances of individuals being saved from death by those they had enslaved. Toussaint Louverture notably saved the wife of his former slave master by escorting her to safety when the Breda plantation was about to be overrun, while figures like doctors and priests who could help the insurgents were taken hostage and protected. Where was Christophe in these earliest days of the Northern Revolt? As with a lot of his early life, the archive is frustratingly silent. In the epic biography of one of Christophe's great rivals, Alexandre Pétion, released decades later in 1857, the historian Joseph St. Remy suggests that in 1791, Christophe was serving in the local police. The local police were almost exclusively recruited from the free black and the mixed race communities, many of whom had previously served in the militia, including veterans of the Savannah campaign. It was a role that brought a good salary. A trooper earned nearly double of a journeyman carpenter. This was further topped up by a share of reward money, since one of the main roles of the local police was to capture and return slaves who had absconded from plantations. Amid the brutal racial politics of the colony, membership of a group such as the local police would have reinforced his social status in his community, as well as redefining his own precarious position as someone with no formal free status and no family network to rely on. In the first weeks of the uprising, Christophe's commanding officer from the Chasseurs Volontaires was placed in charge of leading military efforts against the former slaves on the northern plain east of Cap Français. The commanding officer had attended the meeting of the Estates General in France and was a firm supporter of equal political rights for the colony's free colored population, and now led the militia out into the field. The free mulattoes and Negroes, chiefly mounted, were some of the first troops to enter the burned remnants of the Galliffet plantation, but their eagerness to fight still meant little to the short-sighted members of the Colonial Assembly. The commanding officer criticized France's refusal to cede any ground on political rights and was quickly proved right as to the potential consequences. By the end of the year, the colony's second city, Port-au-Prince, erupted into fighting, not between the free and the enslaved, but between the white colonists and the free colored community, as the two populations divided themselves into armed camps. But for all his presence on this issue, the commanding officer, who owned slaves himself, failed to understand the larger earthquake that was happening around him. He thought that slaves were incapable of independent action and found it easier to believe that their revolt was sparked by the arrival of revolutionary ideas from France, stirred up by provocateurs from the Society of Abolition. Instead, that the belief in liberty could have arrived on the slave ships from Africa in the heart of every captive and was only waiting for the right moment to spark into action. It took time for this idea to sink in, But the wife of the commander came to a conclusion that many colonists would soon follow. The only way to ensure the safety and stability of the colony would be to wage a war of total extermination, not just of the former slaves, but also of the free colored population, who would be branded and deported or be sterilized, while children, to prevent any future where the races might mix. Hopes in the colony that France might send a military expedition to assist the colonial authorities in restoring order were dashed in early 1792 when news arrived that the country had declared war on Britain, Spain, and Holland. By this time, the south of the colony had also become a battleground, with many plantations in open revolt. In the north, the rebel leader Boukman had been killed, but attempts to negotiate a peace deal with the other slave army leaders had faltered. At this stage, their demands were an amnesty for those who had taken up arms and a general improvement in working conditions on the plantations. Complete abolition was not yet part of the plan. After the outbreak of war in Europe, Spanish authorities on Saint-Domingue's eastern border began to actively arm the rebel armies. Cap Français held firm, but continued to be attacked. Christophe may well have taken part in its active defense when the army of Biassou led a raid on a hospital in Eau-du-Cap on the city's outskirts, where he had once been enslaved. For Nathaniel Cutting, there was no rescue in the colony as things stood. He said, "While the insurgents can obtain ammunition from the Spaniards, it will be almost impossible to quell them, and I begin to be of the opinion that it will be the most prudent for government to enter into a treaty with them similar to that what the government in Jamaica formerly made with the Maroon Negroes of that island. Otherwise, the expense of protecting the plantations will exceed their revenue." Cutting's belief never came to pass, but on the 28th of May 1792, a ship arrived in Cap Français carrying news that would have horrified the wife of the commander. 7 weeks earlier, the French National Assembly had declared the political equality of all races. The colony's free colored and black communities were granted full rights as citizens, including the ability to vote and stand for elections. The choice to abolish racial discrimination was presented as the best way to maintain the political and economic foundation of the colonial system. From this moment, the French Empire would only recognize two categories of people, free and the enslaved. For someone like Christophe, this was a transformative moment, a legal guarantee of his status in the new French state that was being built. In September, a new set of revolutionary commissioners arrived from Paris to help implement the new reforms. They were led by a lawyer named Léger Sontenax and Etienne Polverel, both of whom carried abolitionist sympathies and were viewed with deep suspicion by many white planters. In a little over a year, the political and economic order of Saint-Domingue had been turned upside down. A few plantations still operated with their enslaved workforces, but exports had crashed. Many of the countryside was in a state of insurrection, and although none of the major towns and cities had fallen, many of them were wrecked with unrest and disorder, either between the colonists and a free colored class, or between the colonists themselves and the white French, divided into royalist and republican factions. Republicans like Sontenax and Polverel, the revolution in France was an opportunity to trim the wings of the colony's largely royalist, rich white planter class, as much as it was to reinforce the new laws on racial equality. In the spring of 1793, they left Cap Français to restore order to a fractious Port-au-Prince and cities down south, disarming white militias as they went and conferring their blessings on a free-colored military leadership in the region, which was led by a mixed-race planter named André Rigaud, who they promoted to general. Rigaud had been an early supporter of Vincent Ogé and Chavannes, and like the latter, just like Christophe, may have served with the Chasseurs Volontaires in Savannah back in 1779. While they were in the south, a new threat to the revolutionary order arrived in Cap Français in the shape of General François Thomas Galbaud, the colony's new appointed military governor and a former planter from Port-au-Prince. From the outset, Galbaud was dismissive of Sontenax and Polverel as naive newcomers who did not understand the true nature of Saint-Domingue, insisting that as he held military command, he would not take orders from any civil commissioners. He saw himself firmly on the side of the white planters who began to lobby him for support from the moment he landed in the city. The commissioners, they told him, wanted to destroy Saint-Domingue by arming the slave armies and setting them against the white population. Sontenax had insisted that every regiment in Cap Français have at least one officer of color. White troops had attempted to mutiny against the ruling, which only prompted Sontenax to form new units entirely made up of members from the black and free colored communities. They took heart from Galbaud's pronouncement on France's new race laws, saying, "I adopt equality, I even want it, but here it is pushed too far." The stage was set for a clash that would tear the city apart, with Christophe as both witness and participant. The two commissioners rushed back to Cap Français, knowing that the city was being turned against them, but also that they could rely on the free colored population for support. Their first meeting with the new governor was a disaster. Galbaud was particularly shocked at Frontenac's declaration in response to the planters' charges that he was against his own race. "Understand, citizen, that the only thing white about me is my skin." After they refused his invitation to dinner, Galbaud abused them publicly and fights broke out on the dock between white sailors and the commissioner's free-colored supporters. Knowing that it was likely to provoke a showdown, but confident in their ability to prevail, Frontenac and Poverel had Galbaud arrested on charges of sedition and placed on a ship in the city's harbor. It was a risky move. There were dozens of ships moored off Cap Français, many of which had been stranded for months with no cargo to carry, and a mass of disaffected sailors on board. Galbaud managed to galvanize the crew of one ship and then another, promising them that he would lead them in an attack on the city to depose the commissioners and restore white control once and for all. Roused to action, this impromptu marine force of several thousand men swarmed onto the WAPs of Cap Français on the afternoon of the 20th of June. There was a desperate hand-to-hand fighting between these white counter-revolutionaries and the supporters of the commissioners, who were almost entirely made up of the city's free black militia. One of the combatants was Jean-Baptiste Belly, now holding the rank of captain. Another was Christophe. According to Saint Remy, by 1793, Christophe had transferred from the local police to an artillery militia unit led by an officer named Séraphin, created by Frontenac for the city's defense. This is the moment when Christophe finally makes his proper appearance in the written archives, defending his adopted city in the name of racial equality. As the sailors looked to be gaining the upper hand, Frontenac sent an urgent order to the commander of the Cap to place at the disposal of Christophe 2 pieces of 8-pounder cannons for the service of the Civil Commission. Christophe was in the thick of the fighting, and by sunset, the attack on the city had been repulsed. Galbaud's brother, César, who had been one of the first to urge him to take up arms against the commissioners, had been killed. A second attack was launched the following morning with such vigor that the commissioners and the units that included Christophe and Belly were forced to flee to the Cap on the southern outskirts of the city. The arsenal was captured and the doors of the jail were flung open. Cap Français was given over to looting and anarchy. Whether deliberately or by accident, fires were started. Strong breezes carried the flames from roof to roof, and within moments the entire city was an inferno. White residents fled in panic onto small boats and took shelter on the ships. In the aftermath, many would simply sail for Philadelphia or New Orleans as refugees, never to return. The commissioner supporters blamed the fire on Galbaud's men, while the white colonists put the blame on the town slaves. Others yet claimed that Frontenac and Poverel had set the fires as part of a radical conspiracy to destroy the colony. In truth, the commissioners were horrified. Hundreds had been left dead and barely a fifth of the city was left unscarred by the fire. A map produced several months later to survey the damage showed block after block destroyed, including a plot where Christophe's hotel had stood. Only the immediate area around the government house and barracks and a short stretch of the quayside was left unscathed. Galbaud's attempt to preserve the white-dominated system had ended up destroying the most beautiful city. His men had retreated rather than try to take control of what remained, but Frontenac and Poverel barely had the manpower to claim control of what would remain when the fires were extinguished. Only one group had the power to take the hold of Cap Français, and they had been camped within striking distance of the city since they rose against the planters in August 1791. If they could be won to the commissioner's side, Frontenac and Poverel could truly save the colony for France. Delegates were sent out to the 10,000-strong army of former slaves camped on the northern plains to invite them into the city to defend it against the white counter-revolutionaries with a striking offer. We declare at the will of the French Republic and of its delegates to give freedom to all the Negro warriors who will fight for the Republic. All the slaves declared free by the delegates will be equal to all free men and will enjoy all the rights belonging to French citizens. Their daring plan worked. Several thousand insurgents flooded into the city and put themselves under the commissioner's command. 3 weeks later, Frontenac extended the offer of freedom to the families of those who joined the Republic, while Poverel proposed reforms to the plantation system, suggesting that when the revolutionary armies had been defeated, fighters would be given land, and the plantation laborers offered a share of the profits. On the 24th of August, a public meeting of 15,000 people was held in the ruins of Cap Français, which ended with a vote overwhelmingly in favor of the general emancipation. Christophe would have attended, and as the celebratory cries went up in the crowd, he perhaps reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from childhood slavery in Grenada through a shadowy self-emancipation to helping win with his own hands his permanent freedom as a citizen of the French Republic. But the question remained, with slavery abolished, what sort of Saint-Domingue would rise from the ashes? On July 14, 1793, 6 weeks before the General Emancipation Proclamation, Leger Sontenax oversaw an elaborate ceremony amid the charred ruins of Cap Français to mark the 4th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille in Paris. A crowd of nearly 7,000, the majority of them black and newly emancipated, heard him speak in front of a newly planted Liberty tree topped with a red cap, as he sought to tie together the white, the free-colored, and the formerly enslaved under the same banner. Christophe would have attended as a member of the city's militia and joined in the singing to the public oath of loyalty to the Republic. It was less than 2 years since the start of the slave uprising, and a new and radical future for Saint-Domingue was being born. For Christophe, the future was also being reshaped in a more practical way. The day after the celebration on the feast of his patron Saint Henri, he got married. His bride was Marie-Louise Quadavid, another member of the free black community. The Kingdom of Haiti's Royal Almanacs lists her date of birth as the 2nd of May, 1778. One tradition holds that she was born in Wanament, near the border with Santo Domingo, but her family name appears nowhere in the parish baptismal records, and in her will, Marie-Louise herself states that she was born in Cap Français. Her mother may have been a free black woman named Marie-Jeanne, whose daughter Marie-Louise was baptized on the 19th of July, 1778. The child was born outside of wedlock, so the father's name was not noted. But on the 30th of October, 1783, Marie-Jeanne from Petite-Anse, just outside the city, married Jacques Quadavid, a 44-year-old free black non-commissioned militia officer in Cap Français. 2 months later, Marie-Jeanne gave birth to Marie-Louise's brother, Noël Quadavid, whose godfather was Christophe's comrade, Jean-Baptiste Belly. 2 years later, their sister Genevieve was born. Jacques Quadavid likely knew Christophe through the militia, and he would have taken part in the defense of the city alongside his future son-in-law and his son's godfather. Before the revolution, he may have worked as an innkeeper and was wealthy enough to have owned more than one slave. An account of Christophe and Marie-Louise's marriage was recorded in 1814, which suggests that Christophe and his future father-in-law did not always enjoy good relations, although it suggests that Jacques Quadavid died before the wedding. After the burning of the cap, Christophe, now free, wanted to marry the woman who is today his wife. She is the daughter of a rich and highly esteemed free black man who lived in the Cap, in Petit Guinée, in the neighborhood of Café de la Couronne. This father turned down Christophe, who only was able to take his wife after her father's death. In September, Christophe got his first taste of the political rights conferred by the French citizenship by exercising his newfound right to vote. 3 delegates from the colony were chosen to deliver the news of slavery's abolition to the National Convention in Paris. The group's composition was highly symbolic. A white Frenchman named Louis Dufay, the mixed race Jean-Baptiste Mills, and Jean-Baptiste Belly, the survivor of the Middle Passage from Senegal. The men were welcomed into the National Convention to generous applause. Dufay recounted the failed white counter-revolution and how the armies of the enslaved had rescued the colony at its darkest moment. Belly followed with an even more rousing speech. He said, "I was a slave during my childhood. 36 years have passed since I became free through my own labor and purchased myself. Since then, in the course of my life, I felt worthy of being French. It is the tricolor flag that has called us to our liberty." Oh, hell no. Nah, Jean-Baptiste Belly was tripping. But in this situation, I just chalk it up to, politicians doing what politicians do, diplomats doing what diplomats do, reading the room and saying whatever needs to be said, I guess. Anyway, let's continue. When the deputy proposed a vote on the abolition of slavery across France and all its territories, it was immediately agreed upon. As the French Revolution entered its most radical phase, the power of the colonial lobbyists of the Club Mosaic appeared on the wane. Sontenax had been an early supporter of abolition, but his Emancipation Proclamation had been as much as an act of expediency as principle. He came to understand that the insurgent armies were the only force capable of defeating his white rivals, made up of slaves who had emancipated themselves by taking up arms. Through their actions on the 4th of February 1794, they had forced France to abandon slavery throughout its entire empire. In Saint-Domingue, the formal recognition of this new reality was not initially playing out as Sontenax had hoped. Most in the rebel armies had little reason to trust his declaration. They had not waited for liberty to be granted and were supplied arms by the Spanish, who had already promised to confirm their freedom. On the same August day of Sontenax's first declaration, another equally persuasive appeal was made by one of the rebel leaders, proclaiming that he was the sole guarantor of liberty. This man said, "I am Toussaint Louverture. You have perhaps heard my name. You are aware, brothers, that I have undertaken vengeance and that I want freedom and equality to reign in Saint-Domingue. I have been working since the beginning to bring it to existence, to establish the happiness of us all." It was an audacious pronouncement from the former coachman from the Bread Out plantation. He matched his refusal to treat with the French by launching a lightning military campaign and quickly captured a series of key towns, including Plaisance, guarding the mountain road between Cap Français and Port-au-Prince. In December, he captured the port of Gonaïves. It was a measure of Louverture's charisma and tactical wit that many of those fell with barely a shot fired. The Gonaive garrison simply invited him into the town and pledged him their arms. Now, time out. One thing that doesn't get spoken about in the legacy of Toussaint Louverture is the fact that he was an excellent diplomat, politician, beyond military science, because he was definitely a military scientist, but just, excellency in diplomacy. And man, I'm telling you, if he was a black man in the modern day, probably one of our best politicians we would ever have. One of the best, black political minds to ever exist. Dessalines, one of the greatest military minds, but Toussaint Louverture, one of the greatest political minds. Now let's continue. As Louverture's star rose, he began to separate himself from the other rebel leaders, Jean-François and Biassou, both of whom outranked him in the Spanish command. His forces clashed violently with Jean-François' troops, and he accused Biassou of trying to sell women and children into slavery in the areas he controlled. The Spanish tried to broker a reconciliation conference between the three men, but the split proved irreparable. The French Republicans were put further on the back foot by the arrival of a new player bent on taking advantage of the colony's turmoil: the British Army. The week after Belly was elected as a delegate to Paris, the British troops landed in Mont-Saint-Nicolas and the town of Jérémie, the two ports that sat at the very tips of Saint-Domingue's northern and southern peninsulas. Saint-Domingue lay so close to Jamaica that it was too tempting for the British to ignore, in the belief that it would be an easy prize to attack. The initial response to their arrival suggested this would be the case, and like Louverture, they took the towns peacefully. The white planters of Jérémie and Mont-Saint-Nicolas quickly switched their loyalties to the British crown, believing that British rule would mean the return of slavery. In this, they had the full-throated support of Pierre-Victor Malouet, an influential French baron and staunch supporter of the slave system, who had exiled himself in London after the fall of the French monarchy. Across the Caribbean, the British swiftly captured Martinique, Guadeloupe, and St. Lucia, and in February 1794, Malouet signed an accord with the British government on behalf of the colonies, allowing a continuation of slavery in the occupied French Caribbean. Now, time out. For y'all that been watching my channel, y'all know that's not the first time y'all heard that name, Pierre-Victor Malouet. Y'all heard that name many times before. Yeah. Y'all remember when I told you, fast forward to 1814, when the French government had sent those spies down to Haiti to negotiate with Christophe and things like that. And what Christophe do? Christophe killed the French ambassador, right? But you know who sent those spies down to Haiti? You know who sent those so-called ambassadors down to Haiti back in 1814? That was Pierre-Victor Malouet. That was Mr. Malouet right here. They talking about right here. So this is somebody who spent his whole life terrorizing the black man. Spent his whole existence, trying to destroy the black man. Man, that's the name that comes up a lot. For y'all that been watching me, y'all heard that name before, Pierre-Victor Malouet. He became the minister of the Navy and the colonies, the minister of war, when Christophe was the king of Haiti in the north. Now, let's continue. The town of Saint-Marc fell to the British in the same month that Louverture captured Gonaive. And in June 1794, the British captured Port-au-Prince. The colony was being carved up. In the north, no more than in the immediate areas around Cap Français, Fort Liberté, and Port-au-Prince were securely under French control. Only in the south did the Republic continue to hold large chunks of territory under the military leadership of André Rigaud in the town of Les Cayes, who had won some success in winning over the rebel armies of the southern mountains over to the French side. With France so firmly on the back foot, troops in Cap Français were put to work helping to clear the wreckage of the burned out city. The wooden houses of the Petit Guinée district were particularly badly damaged in the conflagration, and for Christophe, finding new accommodation for himself and his pregnant wife would have been a priority. He did at least have the comfort of an improved status. After his service in the defense of the city, he was promoted to captain and transferred to the 2nd Regiment of Grenadiers. His commanding officer was Pierre Michel, one of the leaders of the slave armies who had answered Sonthenac's call and who had been raised to the rank of lieutenant colonel as a result. Pierre Michel's command was at Fort Belair near the city's gates. Jacques Quadavid was also promoted to lieutenant colonel of the artillery battalion and stationed at Fort Belair, raising the possibility that he, Christophe, and Marie-Louise may have lodged together here for a short period of time. These promotions of black officers were common examples of the new colony that Sonthenac wanted to build. Supporting him was Saint-Domingue's new governor, Etienne Lavaux, who had been quickly installed after Galbaud's fall. The former free-colored ranks were equally rewarded for their loyalty, and Lavaux and Sonthenac together put the city's entire military under the command of Jean-Louis Villat, another chasseur volontaire veteran from Savannah. On the 15th of May 1794, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son whom they named François Ferdinand. Christophe had been enslaved at birth, but his first child was born free with all the rights of French citizenship, rights that his father was taking up arms to defend. That defense became much easier later that week when Toussaint Louverture took the decision to abandon Spain and join the Republican side. Suggestions were beginning to circulate in the colony that France would make something like his freedom proclamations permanent. Louverture now accused Spain of wanting black people to continually fight each other until they could be reduced back to slavery. "Let us unite together forever," he wrote to Lavaux, "and forgetting the past, work from now on to crush our enemies and take vengeance against our perfidious neighbors." As Louverture pledged himself to the tricolor, the towns he held for his Spanish paymasters swiftly came back under French control. The following month, Louverture was appointed as the military commander of the entire western province and ordered to mop up the last of the Spanish forces and then take the fight to the British. When Louverture switched sides, he brought with him some 4,000 battle-hardened soldiers along with a new officer corps that would help reshape the future of Saint-Domingue. His two leading officers were Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Moïse. Both had once been enslaved and had close personal ties to Louverture. Moïse was his nephew and was born on the same plantation in Breda. Dessalines' origins remain more clouded, but he was most likely born around 1758 on a plantation in Louverture. This plantation was rented for a short time in 1779 by Louverture himself during an unsuccessful attempt to become a coffee planter. This plantation lease came with 8 slaves, one of whom was Dessalines. Whatever personal history had passed between them, Dessalines joined Louverture's forces around October 1792 and had risen quickly in the leader's eyes through his military acumen. Prior to the revolution, Christophe had viewed his best chance of improving his position to be through membership of the Cap Français Northern military officer class, dominated by the mixed-race community. But now, there was a different model for advancement. Louverture, Moïse, and Dessalines had all been enslaved. Like Christophe, Louverture's father was born in Africa and transported to the Caribbean, and his son had freed himself through his own endeavors and was now on the cusp of becoming one of the most powerful men in the colony. Christophe remembered Vincent Ogé and Jean-Baptiste Chavannes being broken on a wheel in 1791. Vincent Ogé had rejected the idea of freeing his slaves, preferring to put the interests of class above race. In comparison, Chavannes had argued that allying with the enslaved was the only way to win true political freedom. In this new free black officer class, and with the growing political career of Belly, Christophe could perhaps see how a new future might unfold. He was quick to tie his fortune to theirs. Throughout the summer of 1794, Republican forces were finally on the move. In the south, Rigaud pushed the British out of Léogane, a town guarding the approach to Port-au-Prince, and harried the Redcoats almost back to the gates of Jérémie. Louverture took the campaign to Jean-François and Biassou and continued to capture towns along the northern mountain chain. In Europe, Spain suffered a series of battlefield defeats against France and sued for peace. In the resulting Treaty of Basel signed in June 1795, Spanish Santo Domingo was formally ceded to France. Cut off from their patrons, Jean-François and Biassou fled from Saint-Domingue. Biassou settled in Spanish Florida, and Jean-François moved to Spain. Jean-François had tried to base himself in Havana, but again fell victim to colonial racial politics. The authorities refused to give the loyal Spanish general permission to stay, as they feared his presence would inspire Cuba's own enslaved population to rise up against their masters. Christophe's unit under Pierre Michel and Cap Français was now regularly serving under Louverture's command and carrying out operations across the entire north. He almost certainly took part in the October action that routed the Spanish from the towns of Saint-Michel and Saint-Raphael, as well as the December campaign against Jean-François, in which 2 columns led by Dessalines and Moïse routed them from his stronghold in Louverture. The fighting was particularly heavy at Saint-Raphael, where the defenders had dug themselves into a fortified position defended by artillery and a moat. 2 cavalry charges were repulsed before a third finally overran the position. Both Louverture and Christophe were noted horsemen, but still their victory came at the loss of 200 men. On November 4th, Lavaux visited Louverture in the town of Dondon to commend him on a new round of army promotions. Christophe was promoted to major and mentioned alongside Dessalines and Moïse as an officer of note. Also promoted at the same time was Louis Derouleau, the Savannah veteran and the son of a Congo-born chef, as well as the mixed-race officer Augustin Clairvaux, who was known to be a highly capable leader. In January 1795, Christophe was back in the field with Louverture in the Artibonite Valley, fighting against the British. The preferred tactic was hit-and-run ambush. After his troops had waited patiently for 4 days, a lightly defended supply column headed out from St. Mark presented a golden opportunity to strike. The Republican forces captured 7 heavily laden wagons and successfully repulsed a counterattack, leaving more than 60 British troops dead at the scene. In a letter to Lavaux, Louverture singled out Christophe for his leadership in the fight. Now, yeah, man, we can end part 2 right here. And as you can see, we just getting into the early days of the revolution. They haven't even fought the French yet, head to head, 1v1 yet. Right now they fighting the British and the Spanish. They trying to, beat back the British and the Spanish, things like that. These the early days of the revolution, bro. Like 1793, 1794. We got a whole like 10 more years of fighting still left to go. And then we got Christophe's, 20-year reign to talk about after that. It's like, man, let's see, man. Let's see. Shout out to Paul Clammer, man. Shout out to Paul Clammer. Yeah, he's a white dude from Great Britain, so we got to take that into account. We got to keep in mind that it's a white man from a colonial, heritage, but still, he's bringing some good information, man. He's bringing some good information. So we're going to get into it, man. We're going to try to get through this whole entire book, man. Black Crown by Paul Clammer. Anyways, man, it's a Bonefacari, that's Celine back in the building. Yes, indeed. Cash App in the description. Support the album, man. Support the album. Gone. Peace.
No. Feel like I'm 75. Know that your team be full of them traders, you know that can never be mine. I'm grabbing a thought when I drive. I'm back in my zone and we on. She said that she ready to come be my wife, yeah, hoping I don't do her wrong. I gave her my word in this bond. I'm whipping the best like a lamb. I'm eating no chicken and lamb. Accustomed to call me the man. I never be up on the gram. I'm keeping that way undercover. She want me to tell her I love her. I told her I'm breaking the rules. I told her we making the news. Back in my city, they loving me. Standing alone, I'm 100 deep. Enemy plotting and still in reach. They try to make sure that we underneath. Trying to make sure that we never make it. Coming for power, come get acquainted. Coming for everything that I wanted. Feeling like Drake, but I really wrote it. Feeling like Kendrick, I'm checking names. Gotta roll up while I go insane. Got so much stress, I've been gate away. Stuffing these racks in this Louis case. One thing for certain, I'm about to check. Keep it 100 and nothing less. Stick with the family since day one. Had to stay down till my day come. Had to stay down, but I'm never patient. Hop on the mic and I'm motivated. Hop on the mic and I drop a classic. Haters can't see me, they copping glasses. Back in the studio making magic. Got a new tape and it's in production. Back on my business, I got a budget. Staying low key when I'm out in public. Feel like I'm 75. Know that your team be full of them traders, you know that can never be mine. I'm grabbing a thought when I drive. I'm back in my zone and we on. She said that she ready to come be my wife, yeah, hoping I don't do her wrong. I gave her my word in this bond. I'm whipping the best like a lamb. I'm eating no chicken and lamb. Accustomed to call me the man. I never be up on the gram. I'm keeping that way undercover. She want me to tell her I love her. I told her I'm breaking the rules. I told her we making the news.